Thank you, Roberto. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming this morning. It's great to be here. I wanted, since Jim was talking about the Eudaimonia Institute, I wanted to uh, make a plug for the Eudaimonia Institute. I've been here for most of the year this year, and it's been just a wonderful environment for research and thinking. And Professor Addison and his staff have built a wonderful institution, and I'm really proud and happy to be part of it. And I'm happy to be going first because by the time we get through the rest of the presentations, you'll forget what I've had to say. And that's probably a good thing because I'm going to start off on a bit of a negative note, meaning that if we're going to talk about eudaimonia, then we need to talk about the opposite of eudaimonia. My life has been spent mainly uh, talking about how it is and writing about how it is that human beings have not flourished and how human beings have suffered. It's an odd situation. Oh, what am I doing? Thank you. Oh, there we go. When we were writing the conference, thank you, Jim. We were writing the conference proposal. I proposed that before we start talking about well-being, we should talk about something that sociologists might call ill-being, or the bad things that happen to human beings. Most of my career has been involved in studying ill-being among human beings and in human societies, meaning human rights violations, genocide, suffering, social suffering, which is actually different than individual suffering. People actually suffer in groups. They don't just suffer alone. And so I thought maybe as a way to kickstart our conference, I would talk a little bit about how a sociologist approaches the idea of well-being by talking a little bit about what might be called ill-being. So before we can answer questions about human flourishing, well-being, eudaimonia, we need to look at what the forces that cause ill-being or misfortune. And I dibble-dabble in the classics, and I make sure I always ask a classicist, am I using the right terminology? And what I wanted to start off with today was a discussion of what might be the opposite of eudaimonia, which is kakodaimonia. And thankfully, my colleague, Mary Lefkowitz, the great classicist, is here, and I asked her about that yesterday. I said, do I have it right? Do I have that word right? She said, yeah, you have it right. And I said, what's an example of kakodaimonia, the opposite of well-being? And she said, well, I hope you don't mind, Mary, if I quote you on this. You can clarify it later on. She said, you're on a ship and the ship sinks. You go on the lifeboat and the lifeboat springs a hole and starts to sink, and then the sharks show up. I thought that's a pretty good conceptual idea of what kakodaimonia might be. Later on, the idea of kakodaimonia, when it entered into the New Testament and into Christianity, it became more of an idea that there are demons that control your fate, and you can't do anything about that. That's a longer story. So coming to the Eudaimonia Institute and its search for the sources of determinants of human well-being as a sociologist, this was new for me. It was new for me because, as I said, my background was studying the worst things that people do to each other. Misfortunes. I've made my career on studying misfortune among human populations. So coming to an institute that was looking at the source of well-being and happiness was actually quite a relief, I must say, because basically my view, based on the empirical evidence of history, whether it's history, I think history is a slaughter bench, his life is nasty, solitary, brutish, and short. These are the things that kind of color my thinking about human populations and human societies. And mainly my avenue into studying these issues was modernity theory. And I mentioned actually James Hunter last night, who was my mentor at the UVA, who is a modernity theorist, and we study the quandaries of modernity, the difficulties of modernity. The main tradition in sociological theory, sociology, is grounded in understanding the great transformation of traditional societies that resulted from the Industrial Revolution. And mainly, it's focused on the problems of modernity rather than the possibilities of modernity. All major classical sociological theorists examined these problems, and each had a conception of the problems and perils of the condition of modernity. So I've always said that when people say that economics is a dismal science, I said, no, 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 sociology really is the dismal science. We actually study, we focus mainly on social disorganization, social malfunctions, social problems. So I'm not sure why Keynes said that economics was a dismal science, but at least from the point of view of modernity theory and sociology, most theorists, most classical and contemporary theorists, have focused on what goes wrong under conditions of modernity. Most classical theorists are characterized by an analysis of what I would call the duality of modernity. Modernity giveth, modernity taketh away. Modernity gives us things, but it also has consequences for us that are in some ways negative and problematic. And this is, by the way, part of my talk is a reaction to a seminar group that we've been reading at the Eudaimonia Institute. We've been reading Steven Pinker's book, and he doesn't seem to recognize that there's a duality of modernity. He seems to think modernity is teleologically driven one way, and he finds any evidence that he can muster to talk about why it is that modernity is mostly positive. But that goes against the classical tradition of sociology. It goes against most of sociological thinking about modernity. I'll talk first, although I don't consider him a theorist of modernity, and I also am always terrified to mention Adam Smith when James Addison is in the room, because I know I'll get it wrong. But at least my neophyte, my interloper view of Smith, as a precursor of this view, was that capitalism leads to human flourishing. He's very confident about that, but also creates resentment, state of misfortune. I came to the theory of moral sentiments as an outsider to anything to do with formal Adam Smith studies, and what I noticed immediately was how much Adam Smith talked about resentment. Everywhere it's mentioned over and over and over again. Why did he do this? Well, he knew he'd do this, but he did this because he realized that capitalist modernity, that the rise of capitalism and the people moving up in status, moving down in status, would create resentments, and that would be resolved by the sympathy of the impartial spectator. You would present your resentment to people, and they would say, yeah, that's a legitimate resentment, and I sympathize with you, and that sympathy is part of the dialectic between the rise of capitalism and the rise of and states of resentment that are caused by status differentials. Then Marx. Okay, so we'll start with I'm going to go through some of the classical theorists. Of course, it's no secret that Marx thought that technological progress would lead to a widening of inequality and misery. And basically, Marx's texts are essentially critiques of modernity, critiques of fast industrial capitalism. And actually, I have to say this honestly, I actually think Engels was much better in writing about the nature of capitalism than Marx. I make my students read Engels' Condition of the Working Class in England. It's a tremendously detailed, pointed critique of capitalism. It's what I would call an ethnography of misfortune. You can't read that book and come away with a good view of capitalism. And who knows why Engels wrote it the way he did. I mean, Engels was a capitalist. Engels was an elite. But he also saw that his own capitalist background led to extreme misfortune among people. So when I read the works with the Marxist works or Engels works, I see them as ethnographies of misfortune. They focus on the negative aspects of capitalist modernity. And the neo-Marxists, including the Frankfurt School, continue this line of thought by focusing on the negative qualities of capitalism, this fetishism of commodities, which I've always found to be one of Marx's, actually, Marx was right about a lot of things, and he was actually right about the fetishism of commodities, people making sacred things consumable goods. And this was taken up by what I would call Vebelinites, people, if you're familiar with Thorstein Veblen, then you know that Veblen basically wrote the book Theory of the Leisure Class, and in that he talked about conspicuous consumption. And it was always a negative idea that people's consumption was a problem. And in the book I'm writing now, I'm saying, no, it's actually not a problem. It's actually freedom of choice. It's a form of freedom of expression, which means I'm not a Marxist, which I'm happy to proclaim. But the neo-Marxists in the Frankfurt School theorists, who tried to synthesize Freud, Marx, and any number of other thinkers, they wrote about the culture industry and capitalism as a kind of totalitarianism. Especially Adorno and Horkheimer, took this line of thought that modernity was a problem because you had these things called culture industries, which were totalizing industries, which basically colonized the minds of the workers, kept them happy so they could go back to work the next day, and that leisure was basically a farce. Leisure was not really leisure; it was just a respite in order to make sure that the workers showed up for work the next day. This is, the Marxist critique of modernity is really the strongest one, which doesn't really give too much credence or possibility for the virtues of modernity. Although Marx did say that things would get really better for people before they then would have the revolution. He insisted that you had to have for instance, he didn't think the revolution could ever take place in Russia because Russia was backward and the peasant society. He thought that communism would only arise in a society where capitalism had flourished. Move to some of the other classical theorists. Emil Durkheim, much more positive about modernity. Interestingly, his view of the division of labor, he wrote a book, of course, on this, was very much like Adam Smith's. The division of labor allows people to develop their capacities as persons, because they don't have, if they divide their labor, they have much more time to do other things and to develop their capacity as persons. But he also diagnosed modernity in a negative way by saying that social differentiation can create a condition of what he called anomie, or normlessness. 5 minutes left. Okay, I better get through it then. And so, again, Durkheim is very positive about modernity, very progressive about modernity, but he also sees that modernity creates so much differentiation that people feel lost, out of control, don't know what the norms actually are. The real, and this is where I come strongly in as a Weberian, Max Weber described the process of rationalization, the dominance of instrumental reason that strips meaning from the world. And we were talking about translation issues the other day. Weber described the process of stripping meaning from the world, the triumph of instrumental reason. And he uses the word Entzauberung, which in German, I guess the best translation would be demagification. We generally tend to translate it as disenchantment, but it's interesting that he uses that word. It's not really translatable into English, and perhaps some German speakers can clarify that. Weber talked about this process of instrumental reason progressively taking over the world, stripping the world of meaning. My particular emphasis in my work right now is on Georg Simmel and his magnum opus, The Philosophy of Money. He notes, it's an amazing book, really. It's very unknown to most people, but it really is his magnum opus, The Philosophy of Money, where he develops an entire theory of society and an entire theory of modernity. He notes that the rise of the money economy is very important because it allows people who have money to move up through the social hierarchy. So money liberates us from social hierarchies, but on the other hand, it also objectifies our relations with each other. That we engage with each other purely for the pursuit of profit without any sense of subjective well-being between ourselves, but just what's in it for me. And I think Simmel was particularly keen on pointing out in The Philosophy of Money that money liberates us, but it also enslaves us in a different kind of a way. But one of the things I know I only have a few minutes, but I wanted to focus on Simmel's originality, and because most people don't know his work. He discusses some really interesting things in The Philosophy of Money. He discusses ennui, the blasé attitude, and cynicism as products of modernity. He actually is the first theorist, the first classical sociological theorist who actually has a theory of how modernity creates ennui, this sense of not feeling any meaning for anything, the blasé attitude, and cynicism. And he has whole chapters on this kind of thing. So, because I can't cover all of them, he develops this idea of the blasé attitude. And the blasé attitude, we have it now. When you ask a young person, what do you think about this? They say, meh, something like that. Well, Simmel actually diagnosed this around the turn of the century, this blasé attitude as being a condition of modernity. And the blasé attitude, this is a quote from Simmel's Philosophy of Money, the person, quote, has completely lost the feeling for value differences. He experiences all things as being of an equally dull and gray hue, as not worth getting excited about. And this is a condition that he diagnoses in the urban setting of Germany at the time. And he also writes about cynicism, where it's not quite like the blasé attitude. The blasé attitude is indifference. Cynicism is more like, in his words, where every value means nothing. Every value is taken down, but not replaced by anything. To quote Oscar Wilde, it's not, I think, off the cuff. He says that a cynic is somebody who knows the knows the cost of everything with the value of nothing. And Simmel seemed to have kind of captured that idea. The blasé individual, and this is what's, I think, interesting for our present time, the blasé individual responds by searching for some sort of stimuli that actually retains meaning. Again, Simmel writes, and here's a quote from Simmel, out of this blasé attitude emerges the craving today for excitement, for extreme impressions, for the greatest speed in its change. It sounds exactly like what we're going through in modern society right now. People who are bored or blasé or cynical, they turn to social media and they try to energize their lives. But of course, it really doesn't happen that way. They just get excessive. And so what's the point of focusing on this dark side of modernity? Is it just a case, and this is why I wanted to start off this conference with this particular perspective, is it just a case that all these theorists were simply cultural pessimists? Or did they actually diagnose something real in the culture of modernity? Were they all deluded to say this is what happens to us when we become modern? Were they all deluded because they focused on kakodaimonia rather than eudaimonia? I don't think they were. So before we talk about measurements of well-being, I think we need to think about theories of ill-being as we have them in tandem with measurements of well-being. At the very least, we need to avoid the fact of ignoring the misfortunes of modernity and how these relate to the search for well-being and human flourishing. I don't mean to be pessimistic, but I thought it would be an important point to at least stress these theories that make central to their analysis of modernity the fact that humans actually have a difficult time flourishing under conditions of modernity, and that many humans, not just people who are suffering human rights abuses or totalitarian systems, but people generally under conditions of modernity have psychic states, have situations of ill-being that we need to pay attention to before we actually try to measure what makes them flourish. Sorry if I went over my time.
Our next speaker is Professor William Kane from Wellesley College. Bill Kane is the Mary Jewett Geiser Professor of English and American Studies at Wellesley College, where he teaches courses in American literature, American studies, and Shakespeare. He earned his PhD from Johns Hopkins University. He's the author of many books. I also will mention only a few, if you allow me. He's the author of The Crisis in Criticism, and he's also the author of a monograph on American literary and cultural criticism, included in the Cambridge University Press History of American Literature. He's the co-editor of the Northern Anthology of Literary Theory and Criticism and the editor of two-volume Anthology of American Literature, and the author of many textbooks on literature and composition. So today, the title of his talk is Rémi Girard, Mimetic Desire and Christianity. Thank you.
In many books and essays throughout his long career, the literary critic and cultural theorist René Girard presented, developed, and extended provocative ideas about and insights into mimetic desire. Our desires are not our own, Girard emphasizes. They do not come from within. We form our desires on the desires that we perceive in others. They are our models. We imitate them. Always we seek to be aligned with the words and deeds of an envied model, or more generally, with those of a dominant group or crowd. As Girard defines it, desire is extremely potent and controlling. We cannot resist its force, and all too often it propels individuals and societies into rivalry, hatred, and violence. There are descriptions of this formidable power in Sophocles, Shakespeare, and other great writers of the Western tradition, as Girard has demonstrated. But even more, Girard maintains that we witness the operation that is the revelation of mimetic desire, its origins, its consequences in the Hebrew Bible, and luminously in the New Testament. The temptation and sin of Adam and Eve, the story of Joseph and his brothers, the judgment of Solomon, the story of Job, the crucifixion of Jesus, these are among Girard's recurring examples. However, the biblical episode that may have mattered the most to him, one that he invoked repeatedly, is the denial of St. Peter. The details of this story differ somewhat from one gospel to the next. Girard prefers the version of it in the Gospel of Mark, but the core of it is this. At the Last Supper, Jesus predicted that Peter would deny him 3 times. Peter swore that he would not, but when the time of testing came, he did. When others confronted him, the fearful Peter, desiring to belong, desperate to be safely within the group, denied that he knew who Jesus was. I do not know the man you speak of. Girard's explications of the denial bring into sharp focus his theory of mimetic desire. His reiterated point about St. Peter is really a grim point about us, that we are the same as this apostle. We would have betrayed Jesus too. In our own times of test and trial, we have acted and will act exactly as Peter did. Consider Girard's treatment of the denial in the sacrifice. The mob that calls for Jesus' death, Girard explains, is constituted and nourished by swallowing up everything that passes within its reach. It is the black hole of violent mimeticism. Where mimeticism is most dense, the mob emerges. The major example, he continues, is that of Peter's denial. Peter cannot help but imitate their hostility. If we psychologize this denial, if we attribute it to the suggestible temperament of the apostle, we seek to prove unconsciously that in Peter's place, we would not have denied Jesus. It should be recalled that before his denial, Peter too vows never to deny Jesus. He is too preoccupied with the opinion others have of him, not to blindly adopt the politically correct attitude of the milieu at the center of which he has the misfortune of finding himself. All the actors and witnesses of the crucifixion, Girard concludes, are already hostile to Jesus, or they become so, for mimeticism spares no one. We cannot resist the influence of the mob. Inevitably, we succumb to it. No more than Peter would we have remained steadfast, for there is nothing inherent in Peter that explains why he fell, other than the fact that he is a human being who is governed, as are all of us, by mimetic desire. Caravaggio, El Greco, Goya, and other artists have focused on this episode, either the scene of the denial itself or the portrait of the repentant Peter. But today I will concentrate on the gospel account. There, the crowing of the cock calls attention to Peter's guilt, and he weeps bitterly. The story of the denial thus comes to an end, but this is not the end of Peter's life and career, for he became a leader of the faith, an advocate for it, and the head of the church, as Jesus earlier had prophesied he would. The man who denied Jesus died a holy martyr. We know him now as Saint Peter. In a moment of crisis, Peter failed. He betrayed Jesus. He realizes, and we know, what he should have done. On the other hand, according to Girard, at the moment of crisis, Peter could not have done otherwise. And that's because mimetic desire and the contagion that it generates took hold of him, gave him no choice. What then happened in Peter or to him that freed him from the grip of mimetic desire? Girard believes that we can resist mimetic desire, that we do have the power to choose, but we only have it when, through conversion, we recognize the essential and absolute truth that the Gospels express, and that Girard states that his research and interpretation discovered and later verified. Hated by the crowd, forsaken by everyone, Jesus was a victim of mimetic desire, of a hatred that incited the mob to demand his execution. Yet he was a manifestly different scapegoat from all others who preceded him. Jesus knew that he was innocent, and we know that he was innocent. The world-transforming truth that he proclaims through his death, ratified by his resurrection, is that the victim is innocent. For Girard, the extraordinary fact about the Gospels is that they are told from the perspective of the victim. This is the Christian difference. In all other stories and myths of sacrifice, of a scapegoat, we are given the perspective of victimizers who believe that the person they have killed was guilty. Jesus is not guilty. He bears witness for all of us that the scapegoat is singled out, targeted. He exposes the lie of the lynch mob mentality. The members of a mob tell themselves, of course, that they have good reasons for the killing that they do. It is proper, just, necessary. But as he dies, Jesus says, Father, forgive them. They do not know what they are doing. In a late essay on War and Apocalypse, August 2009, Girard sums up his claim. By accepting to be crucified, Christ brought to light what had been hidden since the foundation of the world. The foundation itself, the unanimous murder that appeared in broad daylight for the first time on the cross. In order to function, archaic religions need to hide their founding murder, which was being repeated continually in ritual sacrifices, thereby protecting human societies from their own violence. By revealing the founding murder, Christianity destroyed the ignorance and superstition that are indispensable to such religions. It thus made possible an advance in knowledge that was until then unimaginable. By revealing the truth about scapegoat killing, Jesus has established that those whom we torment, persecute, punish, and kill are innocent. No longer can we pretend that victims are guilty and that peace comes to communities through necessary and justifiable violence against them. If today we persecute others, seizing upon scapegoats, it is only because we have rejected the revelation of Jesus about the innocence of victims. Girard then contradicts the lesson that he says the denial of Peter teaches. There is an answer, solution, remedy to the force of mimetic desire. To make the revelation wholly good and not threatening at all, humans have only to adopt the behavior recommended by Christ, abstain completely from retaliation, and renounce the trend to extremes. No more willful ignorance, an end to destructive mimetic jealousy, competition, and violence. The true pathway to authentic happiness, to salvation, is before us. Imitate Jesus. Take up the cross. Follow him. Can we adhere to this injunction? On our own, our desire is not to. The counterstatement is given by Slavoj Zizek, who says, quote, the true ethical test is not only the readiness to save victims, but also, even more perhaps, the ruthless dedication to annihilating those who made them victims. Girard counsels humility and meekness, the fortitude of self-control, the performance of action that is free from selfish intention and personal gain and power. How should we react to Girard's injunctions? What are the implications of his double-edged position on mimetic desire for our conception of and quest for happiness? There are, I think, at least three. The first, clear to me but not stated by him, is that Girard paradoxically both validates and destroys the myth of American individualism. In Self-Reliance, Emerson announces, envy is ignorance, imitation is suicide. In part, Emerson is correct to condemn envy and imitation. Where he is mistaken, looked at via Girard, is in his view that there is something other than imitation. There is nothing else. There is only mimetic desire. It is not a question of finding out who we really are, of coming into contact with our essential self-reliant selves. There are no essential selves and no self-reliance. Only selves constructed on models to which, for better or worse, we are attracted. We know this with futile concern as we witness and experience social media. The drivers of these media are imitation, social comparison, fear of missing out, rivalry that is saturated in envy and resentment, the intense yearning, especially among young people, to belong to the collective. Jaron Lanier made this point powerfully in 2006 in his essay, Digital Maoism, where he speaks of I quote, a new online collectivism that is nothing less than a resurgence of the idea that the collective is all-wise, that it is desirable to have influence concentrated in a bottleneck that can channel the collective with the most verity and force. What we are witnessing today, he concludes, or rather prophesies, is the alarming rise of the fallacy of the infallible collective. I recall one executive at the center of this technological empire saying that the goal at first was to get people to look, but that now the goal is to make it impossible for them to look away. My translation is that surveillance capitalism, as Shoshana Zuboff terms it, demands that we will be fixated on the others we are not, on the cells we must resemble, on the group that will assure us that we are not alone, not doomed to be separated from the messages, photos, and videos of those who seem eternally to flourish in zones of electronic pleasure. The networks of social media that define and organize our lives are powered by mimetic desire. We cannot deny it. Our intelligence is artificial. The writer Andre Dubus has said that each of us feels that it is imperative that we retain some core privacy, that we possess a membrane of inviolability. But this is true only if there is an alternative to mimetic desire. Girard's claim is that there never has been. In our 21st century transformation into desiring data confirms our lack of agency. Imitation, then, is suicide. But not really, for when we inspect ourselves, there is nothing essential to kill. The second implication is that Western ethnocentrism is more right than wrong. The West has inflicted its ideology and firepower on other parts of the world with terrible cruelty. The historical record of war and conquest and exploitation is obvious. Yet the West, because of its Judeo-Christian system of belief and tradition, also displays at its most admirable an array of forthright social critics and reformers who have shown sympathy for those whom the West has oppressed, dominated, and ruled. There is in the West, Girard insists, an internal critique of the perspective of victimizers, and the sources of this tradition of resistance of the Hebrew Bible and even more the New Testament. What the West has, what Christianity has, is the unprecedented, unique event of the crucifixion. No system of thought, says Girard, is truly capable of creating the thought capable of destroying it. The passion, with its power of revelation, is divine intervention, changing everything for those who embrace it. When asked in an interview, is Christianity superior to other religions? Girard replied, yes. All my work has been an effort to show that Christianity is superior and not just another mythology. Here is the third implication of Girard's argument. If you are a Christian, you should live like one. If you are not a Christian, you should become one. This is the only means through which to achieve true happiness, deep contentment, profound well-being. The superiority of the Christian message each day becomes more visible, Girard maintains. When it is most attacked, Christianity shines with greater truth. It is the greatest revolution in human history. I'm moving to my conclusion. Does Girard mean this literally? He might. At a minimum, he challenges each of us, whatever your religious identity or its absence, you must recognize the lesson for conduct that Jesus taught. You must be Christian even if you are not. You must believe it, be committed to it, put it into practice. The denial of Peter shows that mimetic desire is irresistible. It makes us betray others and ourselves. It hurls us into hopeless cycles of envy, resentment, cruelty, madness. No one on his or her own is equipped to resist it, yet we must, and we can, through Jesus. Christianity, says Girard, acknowledges the ultimate goodness of imitation as well as the goodness and reality of the human person. It teaches that instead of surrendering to mimetic desire by following the newest fashion and worshiping the latest idol, we should imitate only Christ or Christ-like non-competitive models. Do not envy, do not escalate, do not succumb to rivalry, never retaliate. Instead, model your life on Jesus. We could say, impossible, this will never happen. I recall Adorno's point about fascist collectivities and why they are so merciless and unapproachable. Adorno writes, they understand, even as they do not understand, that if they were to stop to reason for a second, the whole performance would go to pieces and they would be left to panic. Girard's reply is that if there is no breakthrough in consciousness, if the choice for Jesus does not happen, then we are headed toward an apocalypse of our own making. The future will show ever more intense rivalry among persons, rivalry among nations, dangerously bad imitation, despair, anger, jealousy, vengeance, danger on all sides, unchecked desire for power, prestige, and position. Social media will delude us into thinking we are agents who make choices when all the while we register that the choices we imagine that we made were already programmed into us. For each of us, there will be no inner peace, no happiness, but instead torment and effacement. And for the world, there will be doom and destruction, the fire next time. To end with this is, on one level, predictable. We know this future. I am struck also by the insidious ease with which resentment has entered into my tone of voice. This tone is all too familiar as well. We know that we have become hardwired into networks of imitative desire and anti-personhood. Our motto is the title of Andrew Sullivan's 2016 essay, I Used to Be a Human Being. The images of our planet's future are the flaming landscapes in California that each day become harder to extinguish, and the demonstrations by the Gilets jaunes, a modern-day jacquerie, an emotional wildfire stoked in the provinces and directed against Paris, and most of all against the elite, a carnival-like delight in the subversion of norms, a deliberate embrace of the grotesque. Karl Jaspers, in 1930, on the eve of Hitler's triumph, brooded on the obscure laws of an inexorable course of human destiny. He asked, may not some absolutely essential substance be slowly used up, so that we shall all infallibly perish when the supply is exhausted? We could say that Girard gives us one framework and that there are others, but it could be that his is the one that is right. Thank you.
Our next speaker is John Rodden. John has taught at the University of Virginia and the University of Texas at Austin, among other institutions. He's the author of several books on diverse topics, including The Legacy of George Orwell, The History of Post-World War II Germany, Human Rights Abuse under East German Communism, The Art of Literary Interviewing, The Heritage and Achievement of the New York Intellectuals, The Magic Realism of Isabella Land, and Contemporary Latin American Literature. His forthcoming book is from Princeton University Press, Becoming George Orwell. Thank you. John, the title of his paper today is Surviving or Thriving, a Life Experiment in Abstinence and in Indulgence.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and I must say, having addressed such significant topics, it's also somewhat embarrassing to me to move from these questions of universal significance to my own particular life. That is, this title is Surviving or Thriving, a Life Experiment in Abstinence and Indulgence, and of course the experiment is my own. And I probably should even reword the main title. I mean to say Surviving and Thriving, not an either or. In fact, that title is filled with dualisms and potential contradictions. But in fact, that is my own life. And I must say also that I'm speaking here as a literary and cultural historian whose background is in English and German specifically. So this may be quite under-theorized. You know, and I'm sure all of us have this feeling. Few of us will have the greatness to think the thoughts and write the books of a René Girard, let alone Adam Smith and Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and on and on and on through Weber and Durkheim and Zimmel. But all of us have stories to tell and to live a certain kind of life, and ultimately a life to pursue happiness, Eudaimonia. Now, much of my approach to this question comes from having taught for many years, first at the University of Virginia and then at the University of Texas, a course in utopian imagination, that is the history of utopian studies, in which case we discussed some of the great books from Plato through to the anti-utopias of George Orwell, and then on to the present, which really represented a kind of utopian turn. Now, those utopian experiments cannot be really examined without provoking the question, well, how would I live my own life if I turned it into an experiment, indeed a utopian experiment? And that was very much the spirit of this course. It was an elective course, but we always had a large number of students from a variety of different fields. And these students were so interested in the personal question as they were starting on their own lives and soon going to be moving beyond college into the brave new world of beyond school. And so it came about this way that I began to reflect much more seriously on this question about my own life. And what I'd like to do this morning is to share some of those reflections in three parts, rather briefly. First, the background and aspirations for conducting this experiment. And briefly, the experiment, as I say, was to answer the question, what might life be like if I leave school, finally? Could an intellectual life, a rich scholarly life, be in fact led in these times outside the academy, and indeed without any visible means of support from any institution, think tank, little magazine, so on? Well, and of course my intimate report is that it can be done. One can live it. I've done so for 25 years, ever since resigning my position at the University of Texas. And yet, living is not the point. Surviving, that is, can one thrive? Can one flourish, prosper? Can one really take some concrete steps in one's own terms toward happiness, some spirit of eudaimonia? Secondly, the experiment itself. So my aspirations and background for conducting an experiment like this first. Second, what was the experiment? And then thirdly, what the experimental results have been. And in the third section, I just hope to briefly discuss these topics in light of these larger questions as I see them, namely biography in the life course, or some sociological concepts like agency and the lack thereof, the law of unintended consequences and unforeseen consequences, and throughout it all, role strain. So then first of all, this interim report, this idea of the background I've mentioned in passing then with this course in utopian studies and my aspirations. You see, my hope here is that this would not simply be some kind of anecdotal statement of a rather arbitrary nature, but that maybe the irreducibility of the individuality of all of us could serve as a contribution to science, that each of us would have a story to tell, and this would simply be mine. And mine is somewhat unusual given the context that many of us have been in, insofar as I was blessed with some fantastic early opportunities and then walked away to do something very different, but nonetheless stayed connected with many of my old friends and colleagues and continued to think about the ideas I was working on when I was in the academy and continued to write about them in a very eclectic way across a number of different disciplines. So that's, I guess, the largest aspiration, that each of us then would be provoked to think more concretely about our stories, about our own biography and life course, and what we might have to say to this larger question. Because as far as that's concerned, these are the particulars of our lives. I think of Goethe in Faust, Grau ist alle Theorie, dear Freund, aber grün des Lebens golden Baum. Gray is all theory, my friend, but green is the golden tree of life. So theory without practice or without lived experience really doesn't have much value, and certainly not if one's talking about something like happiness. What did I really know about happiness, I asked myself. When I was first invited to come, I thought, who am I? What am I? What justifies me in talking about myself and not about my hero like George Orwell or René Girard or thinkers from Adam Smith up to Zimmel and beyond. And it was just the question that stayed with me until I finally said, well, whatever you know about happiness and its pursuit comes from having lived a certain kind of life and comes from the life experience of having shared that life with people that you know. And if that's the case, then maybe you need to face down that inner critic that says, you're a nobody, you have nothing of value to say, and offer your story. At least as something rather different from what other people will probably be choosing to do. And maybe take the risk of trying to write an essay that's very different from the kind that you feel most comfortable with. I feel far more comfortable with a more impersonal way of approaching things that address my heroes, because no one denies that George Orwell or the New York intellectuals or various German thinkers who I've written about are of large concern and significant. They've been written about by countless other people, and so that alone justifies it. So having crossed that Rubicon, I offer this story in that spirit, just as a case history, a case study of what one person might have to contribute. Well, what was the experiment? That's my second section here. And the experiment, as I say, was to move into and then out of the academy. Now, I think rather dramatic in the sense that it's not something that almost everybody I ever spoke to thought about. all kinds of dissatisfaction. People would say, oh, if I didn't have to be on this committee or do that, have this class to teach, and so on. They felt blessed on the whole by having their positions, but of course not without dissatisfaction. And much of what I have to say, of course, then is common knowledge. But as we all know, common knowledge is not common practice. When I first left, people just said, well, I thought of that countless times myself, but I would never do it. And maybe that was my tragic mistake from the point of view of my family. That is, I did do it. And having done it, I became an independent scholar. And I see that my name tag reflects that. And I can recall a conversation with my dear old father from County Donegal, Ireland, not too long after I made the move, and proudly explained that I was now an independent scholar. And he remarked, I wish you had remained a dependent scholar. And in fact, I realized that his greatest worry was that I would soon become a dependent scholar on him. And fortunately, the tables were ultimately turned in a way that, having lived a single life, I never experienced. Namely, when he was dying 6 years ago, during the last 2 years, I became his caretaker. And more recently, during the last 2 years with my mother. And all of you in this room have experienced, I'm sure, or almost all of you, the kind of love and service and the steadiness of commitment that a family or a partnership entail. And I had never done that. It was the closest experience I ever had or probably will have to fatherhood. And it was an incredible experience. So, but I don't view it as so much my serving him or mother, as rather it was an experience of mutual dependence or interdependence. So this experiment had a number of good outcomes, but essentially then it was leave-taking. It was made possible because I had a couple of extraordinary, unusual experiences when I was a graduate student at the University of Virginia. This is 40 years ago. Things were very different back then as they are now. I'm sure anyone who's middle-aged like me in the room will acknowledge. In brief, it was the early 1980s, and I had decided I would begin working on a book on George Orwell. And as I made headway, this book was accepted by Oxford University Press. Now, I hadn't yet formed a PhD committee. The PhD committee was hastily assembled and more or less just ratified this book manuscript. Certainly my advisors, they said nothing like that had ever happened, that they could ever recall. And then it followed up by gaining an offer to teach, but not in my department, because that would have been nepotism. Instead, a position was found for me in a related department, Department of Rhetoric and Communication Studies, not in English or German. And so I received a position there without ever having applied for a job, at least beyond whatever the job interview was in this department that already knew me because I'd been teaching there 3 years. I'd been already teaching a bit because I was involved with the British debating programs over the years. And the English-speaking union used to have these courses in rhetoric, so I would take them in preparation. But I never had any formal course in this field that I was now going to be teaching undergraduate and even master's level students. Well, that was followed by a couple of outside offers. And anyway, in the end, I remember a conversation I had with Richard Rorty, and he said to me all the different problems he had, and it was as if I suddenly had this flash that, wow, that's what it's like at the very top. Maybe I shouldn't even climb any higher. I've seen already the best. And you know, then I went away to the Black Forest for a couple of years just to finish this manuscript and experience something very different. Before I even taught, came back and taught for 5, 6 years. And when things just didn't work out completely to my satisfaction, decided, I'm going to run this life experiment. I'm going to leave. All right, now what have been the results, the experimental results? On the surface, of course, it is a story of agency, I would say. Here's somebody who went ahead and decided that he was just going to pursue in the face of all unlikelihoods his life dream and live on a very modest but high four-figure income. As my father would say, that's a very high four-figure income you have this year. And some years that was the case, doing that and living from savings. But I had extremely low fixed costs. So I was able to do that and have been more or less able to make this work out. Now, the life of an independent scholar is not highly remunerative in most cases, certainly not if you're doing scholarly books with serious topics. But somehow I made it work. But then there was a lack of agency that as I began to realize that, well, in some ways, am I not also just a creature of advanced capitalism who's seeking freedom and personal liberation in the most extreme form? That is, I want to be free of all these responsibilities so that I would even be sitting in committee meetings and sometimes saying, wow, is this what I want to be doing with my life? Rather than just being realistic and saying, this is part of what it means to be a professor, part of the service university. That's why I was so saved by the very end, I think, because I had prized freedom above everything else. How much are you willing to pay? I was always saying to myself, in order to be freer. It's just most people didn't want to pay what I was willing to pay. I was willing to pay everything in order just to be free. It cost me a very, very intimate love relationship. That's all worked out beautifully because now she's really my best friend, and maybe I was even blessed in that respect because she had her first child with Down syndrome and the second child also severe autoimmune disease that she discovered had to do with her family. Those would have been my two children. Could I have handled that? I don't know. So all these things are so ironic. I think of Rousseau in Emile, the blessings of liberty are worth many wounds. And I will say that, yes, there have been many wounds. I could mention the fact of not having health insurance for several years in which I didn't check things out like I wish I had, and so certain things happened. I could mention other unforeseen consequences having to do with financial decisions that I should have made. But I will say that I never regretted this step. I regretted maybe some follow-up, but I felt that it was absolutely necessary for me. And so both agency and lack of agency. Inclusion, and that's my life story. And it's just been a great pleasure and honor to be able to share a little bit of it with you and to have this opportunity when I think about all the different ways in which I've been able to reflect on resources that are available to anyone to nurture these possibilities. For me, it had to do with nature, like in the Black Forest, vitamin N, with art and literature, which has certainly sustained me throughout. Friendship, possibility of being with my two oldest friends on this panel, first time we've ever shared a panel, let alone both of them together. Now that is Eudaimonia. Travel, I've had the freedom even beyond what so many of you in the academic world have had. I can just go anywhere at any time if I can somehow scrape up the resources to do it. And then even more recently, this caretaking of my parents, which gave me the feeling of love and service that I think, in a sense, saved me from so many of the dangers of unfettered freedom. Freedom, not as an end in itself, but freedom to serve. That was, I think, maybe the dearest lesson that I've had in recent years. Thank you so much.